All right guys, we're gonna have a quick look at the laying cuff lateral raise, the main variation that we programmed for the lateral delts. So we're gonna start off just actually by looking at the setup now. You'll see Charlie's lying flat here at the moment, and we'll discuss how we can potentially alter this in a short while. But the first thing we actually have to look at is the distance of these arms here. Now, you might have some cable stacks, you might not even have access to a cable stack that you can adjust the arms on. You might be stuck with a fixed cable stack, but let's just assume you've got access to some form of functional trainer. We've set this up specific for Charlie. You know, he's quite a tall individual, he's got quite long limbs, and so for him, if you just put your wrist up, Charlie, in terms of the resistance challenge we want to provide at the start of this is quite challenging for him in this length and range, and that's very much on purpose. However, if we wanted to almost make it a little bit easier, if we hold that for a second, we could see if we bring this closer, now that angle becomes a little bit more steep towards him, so i.e. the line of the cable gets a little bit closer to the shoulder joint. So what we're saying here is that if you want to make it a little bit easier out of the start position, you bring the cable arms more narrow. If you want to make it a bit harder out of that start position, we can bring the cable arms wider. Now, this particular setup for Charlie really does allow just a nice equal challenge, generally speaking, the whole way through. He is going to be challenged a hell of a lot down here, but most of the resistance is going to come around about that midway point, and then it's going to drop off in towards that short position. Now, that's probably one of the major advantages we get about this flat bench. We'll bring it down. When we take it to a slight incline, we'll take this off a second, Charlie. For some people, this just might feel much more congruent. It might feel just a lot nicer on the shoulders. It feels like a more comfortable movement. The only disadvantage that we get here is we don't get quite as much of a drop off of the weight of the arm in terms of when you get into that short position. Now I'm going to get Charlie to actually cuff up on both here. So we set the bench up, the preferred distance for the individual and for the goal of the exercise away from the cable stack. And now what you'll notice as well is that Charlie hasn't got his hands all the way down here. You'll notice that there's the line of the cable here, and his wrist is in line with where the cable stack is. Now, as Charlie goes through this first rep of the movement, what we'll notice is that the line of the cable doesn't ever kind of go high up or drop down, so it doesn't end up being like crazy high and it doesn't come down crazy low. It pretty much keeps the line of that cable in line with the cable stack throughout the entire movement. Now, things we want to be mindful of when we're doing this movement here is, if Charlie comes to the start, is really making sure that we don't just rush or thrash out of that position. It's really important to contract those side delts first, then control it through into that short range. Now, another mistake people will make on this as well is that they'll almost stop too short. They'll get up to shoulder height because that's what we were told to do. And really, we're not going to get the side delts into that fully shortened position unless we take it all the way up into that short position. All right, and then one more rep, Charlie. So things to consider as well as we get to this end point here, we want to make sure that we're not falling down. We want to make sure that we're really in control into that end point. You should find that you get a really nice natural drop off in that top position. Now, the last point as well is that as you get tired on these, it is going to be perfectly normal for the range to start reducing down. So you might get to a point where you can only get to here. That's perfectly fine. Doesn't mean that the set stops there. You want to continue going to the point until you literally can't really do any more partial reps. And relax there, Charlie. All right, and just a couple of additional setup considerations to think about as you set up for this exercise. All the other same execution points, for lack of a better term, kind of stay the same, but we just have to be mindful of how we set up the cuff and our positioning of our arm actually has quite a big influence on the output of the exercise. So for example, we have the cuff at the wrist, and for the most part, we would tend to program this the majority of the time here. However, for some individuals, depending on how their shoulder feels, some individuals might feel if they just slide that further up the forearm, even closer to the elbow, reducing that moment arm from here to here, what can happen is that can just sometimes feel a little bit more comfortable on the shoulder. The other thing that we'll see as well is that some will prefer to perform this movement with a slightly bent arm, and just do a couple of reps, Charlie. Now you'll see that that's not quite 90 degrees, but it's quite a significant arm bend, versus if you were to do it with a completely straight arm. And we'll do one rep there. Now, neither of these two are wrong. All it is that with that slightly bent arm, you're going to reduce what we call the moment arm a little bit, so the tension demands are going to be slightly less. However, for some individuals, keeping the arms fixed in that position is going to just feel a little bit more comfortable. So the key takeaway here really is once you've went with your preferred wrist setup and once you figured out how much elbow bend like in terms of flex or extension that you actually want in the arm. We just have to make sure that we're not changing that throughout the movement. So for example, going from here and then bending towards the end last minute. If you're gonna have that slight elbow bend, for example, or you're gonna have that arm straight, make sure you're keeping the forearm and the arms nice and rigid and stiff so that that elbow joint is nice and secure, and then make sure that's maintained throughout the entirety of the movement.